Hi, I'm Dustin Abbott, and I'm here today to give you my review of Viltrox's newest lens. This is the autofocusing 56mm F1.7 for Fuji X mount. Now, they already had an existing 56mm F1.4 lens, but what's interesting is that Viltrox is kind of building both up and down at the moment. Their earlier lens belonged to they had certain series of lenses that were coming out that were moderately priced, moderately featured, moderately performing. They've obviously gone in the direction of much higher performing lenses with more feature, much better optics, better autofocus, all of those things. But then they've also gone in the other direction where for the first time they're using plastics in some of their lens designs and creating a series of inexpensive lenses that, have a little bit lower grade of build quality, though I will say these lenses feel quite tough. But more importantly, these lenses, though very inexpensive, are actually receiving some of the trickle-down effect of the optical improvements that the brand is making in general, making them really, really intriguing lenses. So this is a budget telephoto. It is a full frame equivalent of about 85 millimeters. Right now it is just for Fuji X mount, and it's coming at under $150 US in terms of pricing, making that really, really intriguing. So is this a lens worth buying? Well, let's dive in together right after a word from our sponsor.
Today's episode is brought to you by the Fantom Duffel, a new unique convertible duffel bag that starts as a compact packable case that easily fits into your luggage or carry-on bag, but then converts into a 35-liter duffel. The exterior is made of 1680D ballistic nylon, which is tough and weatherproof. The interior has a high-visibility reflective finish that allows you to easily see what's inside, even in a dim hotel room. A large foam pouch on the side has a cable pass-through to allow for charging, and the removable straps use a fidlock system to easily and securely connect them. I've been using it for the gym, and it has room for my water bottle, a change of clothes, a basketball, my massive shoes, a towel, and a charger for my cell phone. Visit store.fantomwallet.com to check it out and use code DUSTIN20 for 20% off when you're ready to check out.
So as noted, this lens is at 56 millimeters when you use the 1.5 times crop factor of Fuji's APS-C X-mount sensor. That gives you a field of view of 84 millimeters, a full frame equivalent, or a right under 30-degree angle of view. Now, as noted, this is the second 56 millimeter from Viltrox, and while this is the less expensive of the two options available now for Fuji's X-mount, if you take a look at this MTF comparison, this is where I was really, really impressed. I put a line through at the 80% mark, and you can see that almost all of the performance of this lens is above that 80% mark, while almost none of the performance of the earlier 56 millimeter f1.4 lens even reaches that 80% mark. And so we can see that this is a really, really impressive lens optically. I brought out the 20 millimeter f2.8 as a point of comparison. I have in some ways raved about this lens that, being a kind of a plastic fantastic. Although again, it's tough plastics, and that's the same for the build quality here. Very similar in terms of the kind of basic design. This has an interesting maximum aperture of f1.7 versus the more typical f1.8. And in fact, in the way that most cameras are set up, you don't actually go to f1.7 as a stop or an option along the aperture range there. And so f1.7 is 1/2 stop lower than f1.4. Now, by comparison, f1.8 is 2/3 stop slower than f1.4. And more typically, you have 1/3 stops there along the way. And so, for example, from f1.4 to f2, you would have f1.6, f1.8, and then f2. So f1.7 obviously falls in between f1.6 and f1.8. So it is a little bit brighter, and so it'll give you a little bit more light gathering than an equivalent f1.8 lens. Now, this lens is obviously very, very compact, much like the 20mm that I've alluded to before. You can see that this is basically a palm-sized lens. It is 65mm or 2.6 inches in diameter, has a common 52mm front filter thread up front, which by the way is shared with the 20mm f2.8. And the lens is even shorter than that 20mm lens. It is only 54.7mm or 2.15 inches in length, and it weighs in at 171 grams, which is about 6 ounces. So it is very, very lightweight, and while we don't have anything like a weather sealing gasket here, we do have kind of a coating on the front element to help with fingerprints and things like that. Now, the plastic lens hood is also included, though I do have one minor complaint similar to what I saw here, and that is that it doesn't bayonet firmly into place, and that it doesn't really lock there at all. It's not hard at all to move that to the side. So you may need to watch out to make sure that the lens hood doesn't get kind of off kilter. Sometimes that can produce a little bit of a vignette effect, though it's less likely to happen with a telephoto lens like this. The lens itself has no features on the side. There's no switches, no buttons. All we have is the manual focus ring. Fortunately, the manual focus ring itself is nicely damped. It has good feel to it. And so what it is here is well executed. The only other thing that we have here as far as a potential feature is that here on the lens mount, we do have that USB-C port that allows for easy firmware updates. And once you learn how to do Viltrox firmware updates, they are very, very quick and they're very, very simple. Maybe the most straightforward and easy process of any of the lenses that I do updates for. Now, 85mm-ish lenses are rarely very good when it comes to maximum magnification. This lens is no exception. It can focus down only as closely as 55 centimeters, and it produces a 0.11 times. 0.12 times is about average for the class, and the highest that I've seen for typical lenses, kind of non-macro designs, is just 0.14 times. So it's not great, but it's really not far off from what the norm is for this particular lens, and it is a hair better than what we saw from the earlier 56mm f1.4. So overall, again, not a whole lot here in terms of features, but the lens itself does feel well made. Autofocus comes via a lead screw type STM or stepping focus motor. Now, on Sony, I found that the focus motor on the 20mm f2.8 was great, no problems at all. I'm a little bit less impressed with this lens on Fuji platform. Now, to be fair, probably a good part of that is Fuji itself. Fuji's autofocus is just not as sophisticated, and that's particularly true when you get to the video side of things. So what I found, as you can see here in my focus test, is that focus is it's what we would call deliberate. It is not quick. There are some visible steps. I particularly noticed it making major focus changes in dimmer light. You can see outside it's a little bit better, but it is still not lightning fast at all. There is less of a kind of a real world issue when it came to normal autofocus changes, which tend to be less extreme. And so I didn't really notice autofocus being slow so much in everyday use, though obviously if you're making a major focus change, it's not as quick as what you would like. What it is, however, is quiet, and it is also very accurate. And so if your priority is just getting results that are well focused, you're not going to have any problem with this lens. It definitely gets the job done. It was actually fantastic as a portrait lens. Autofocus speed was fine for that, but more importantly, autofocus accuracy was very good. And as we're going to see, the optics in this lens are actually lovely. And so as a byproduct, I did multiple portrait sessions with it, and I was really pleased with the results, both in the focus accuracy, but more importantly, in the look of the images as well. Now, on the video side of things, I found that autofocus pulls, they're rather slow, and there is some obvious steps as a part of the process. Again, unfortunately, that's pretty typical on Fuji with rare exceptions. I did find that when I did the hand test that it was a little bit better, and you can see that focus breathing is nicely low, but because the autofocus is not particularly reactive, there's that one point at the end where it actually missed the transition from the hand to the eye altogether because it just happened too quick for it to react. Now, ironically, in real-world shots where I just wanted to gradually pull focus from one to another just by moving it along, it actually does fairly well for that because that slower, more deliberate autofocus change actually is tuned nicely for a more cinematic type look. and so it's not abrupt or snappy, but rather more smooth. And so I actually didn't mind it for video work in that particular setting, though obviously autofocus in general is what I would consider to be the weak point of this lens's design. I'll actually be interested to revisit it should they release a, for example, a Sony E-mount version in the future. I suspect that autofocus will be more pleasing in that kind of application, but I can only report on what I see here on my Fuji X-H2 camera body. So I would say if you're looking for a recommendation from me as to whether or not this lens will work for you, if you're planning to do portrait work, event work, general purpose work, I think it will be fine. If you're looking for a lens to keep up with small children or pets or sports, you need to look elsewhere. Focus speed is just not adequate for those kinds of applications. Now we get to the really good part of things. This lens has an optical design of 11 elements in 9 groups, but surprisingly, of those 11 elements, 7 of them are exotic elements, including 4 ED or extra low dispersion elements and 3 HR or high refractive index elements. The MTF looks amazingly consistent, which of course is incredibly important when you're talking about making a lens that works on Fuji's incredibly demanding 40 megapixel sensor, as is found in my X-H2. The fact that Viltrox developed this lens specifically for, at least first for, Fuji's X-mount platform tells me that they knew the optics were good enough to handle this, and in fact they certainly are. We'll break that down more in my detailed optical breakdown that follows my conclusion here in a few moments. So if you want that, you can either jump ahead to that or stay tuned for that in just a moment. But I'll give you the highlights here. There is very low distortion, just a little bit of pincushion distortion. I used a -3 to correct. Vignette is heavier, about 3 stops of vignette, a +75 to correct, though on Fuji, it is receiving correction profiles. And so for JPEGs in camera, I did find that distortion and vignette were corrected for there, and there is already available to me in Lightroom a correction profile there for raw images. So not really all that big of an issue. I saw next to no fringing from this lens, even in really demanding situations. On my test chart, there's nothing to see there, but I shot into the reflector dish of a light that I recently reviewed, the Molus X60, and in that very bright, shiny reflector dish, I just couldn't see any kind of chromatic aberrations or fringing in there, so very, very impressive. Also didn't see it in the corner of images. Lateral type chromatic aberrations weren't there either. There is excellent wide open sharpness all across the frame from the center right out to the corners, a very consistent sharpness profile. And if I compare that to some recent lenses that I reviewed at this focal length, it obviously blows away what I saw from the Sirui Sniper 56mm F1.2. Even when I stopped that lens down to f1.8, it isn't anywhere close to being as sharp at this lens at any point. Here you can see the corners. I also found that it is sharper than the soon-to-be released but already announced TT Artisan 56mm f1.8 lens. A very good lens, by the way, but this lens is, while that lens is consistent in this, fairly consistent in the center of the frame to this one, the Viltrox is sharper in the mid-frame shown here and then also in the corners. In fact, I found that even with the very expensive new Fuji AF 56mm f1.2, the WR version, which I'll be releasing a review of very shortly, actually found that while the Fuji is better in the center of the frame, this Viltrox is arguably a little bit better in the mid-frame and the corners in terms of sharpness when I looked at them comparatively, f1.7 with the Fuji stop down to f1.8. So this is a very impressively sharp lens. Get a little bit more contrast as you stop it down a bit. I noted that more in real-world results than I did in my test chart, in these couple of comparisons shown here. I also found that when stopped down, it was very consistent in terms of sharpness for landscape type images as a secondary application, and beautiful, beautiful results for portrait work, which included very nice bokeh quality and also very, very nice color. Surprisingly good in that application, which I think pretty obviously points to what is the best use of this particular lens. You will see diffraction start to pop up on high resolution bodies at f11 and quite obviously by f16. Finally, I found that even flare resistance was fairly good for a short telephoto lens. Wide open, not a whole lot going on there. In real world images, not really any kind of major issue. And to stop down, a bit more of a ghosting pattern, but nothing significant. So in conclusion, I've been surprised by these lenses in that my reaction to them, as I actually use them, I didn't go into this one in particular expecting much, a little bit more because of this one in the 56mm, but actually find that they kind of tug on the same sweet spot in my heart as Samyang's Tiny series, and that these are lenses that just exceed your expectation. It looks so small and so inexpensive, and so you don't expect much, and then it's just so much more than what you anticipate. It is a very competent, lightweight lens, and the fact that it's at such a low price point is going to make this an incredibly appealing lens. I'd say in particular for those that are looking for a budget portrait lens. The actual results here are gorgeous, and as long as you don't need really snappy autofocus, this is a lens that I think is really going to delight a lot of Fuji X-mount shooters. I'm Dustin Abbott. If you want more information, you can either read the full text review that is linked in the description down below. There are buying links there as well as a discount code, my name, that will give you a 8% discount if you buy it from Viltrox. And if you want more information now, you can jump in with me and we're going to do our detailed image quality breakdown.
So we'll start by taking a look at vignette and distortion. You can see just a tiny bit of pincushion distortion there, which by the way is often flattering in a portrait lens, so you may not even want to try to correct that a little bit there. Vignette is a little bit heavier in the corners. You can see my manual correction on the right here. I've dialed in a -3 to correct for what little distortion there was. And in the corners, I've dialed in a +75. But to give you an idea, on the left side, this is uncorrected. On the right side, this is corrected. And this isn't necessarily a dramatic example, but of these two, if I were looking at them blind, just or side by side here, I actually favor the uncorrected result. I like a little bit of that natural vignette, drawing the eye towards the subject. Your mileage may vary, obviously. Now you can see here on the left, I've got a JPEG correction compared to the raw image on the right. There's definitely some in-camera correction that is taking place for JPEGs, and then also there is a correction profile for raw images, and you can see that the JPEG and this corrected raw now look pretty similar. I also noted that longitudinal chromatic aberrations were really well corrected. You don't see much before or after the plane of focus. I saw that here in some specular highlights, very little fringing around these. And then also in this shot, I was really quite impressed. Even if we punch into a 200% magnification, you can see these really reflective surfaces. There's very little fringing there. And if you look at this rim where it's all just bokeh, you can see that there's just no fringing taking place there. A really impressive result. Likewise, if we look at the corners of images like this, you can see next to no lateral chromatic aberrations there as well. So overall, fringing is not an issue with this lens. So we're going to check out our sharpness results. This is on the 40 megapixel Fujifilm X-H2. We're going to look at 200% magnification. As noted previously, this lens is just really impressive for such an inexpensive lens in its sharpness across the frame. You see the mid frame looks fantastic. If anything, it's actually a hair sharper than the center of the frame. Consistently, as we track down, everything is nice and sharp, and those corners are actually really impressive. Now, I will note that this lens is just a little bit softer on the left side than it is on the right side. You can see if we look here, and then if we come over to here, it's just a little, centering is not flawless. Again, not surprising in such an inexpensive lens. Neither is it bad either. I'll also note that this lens is sharp enough that it really actually benefits well from the enhanced details effect in Lightroom. Now, obviously, that takes extra storage and all of those things, but you can see that the text is just crisper still. If we look up into this zone, it's just smoother, a little bit less of the jaggedy edges, just a really smooth, allows that sharpness to sing, and even more of those details to emerge here in the lens, making it even more impressive. Now, as I alluded to, even if I stop down the Sirui Sniper 56mm F1.2, which I was very clear was not a particularly sharp lens, but you can see that it's destroyed by this Viltrox, at least in terms of sharpness and contrast. The Sniper does have really nice bokeh, so I don't want to trash it here. But you can see that as far as sharpness goes, it doesn't matter where you look in the frame. It's not even a contest. Like the Viltrox is just so much sharper, just great, flawless details compared to what looks like kind of a haze over all the details. Now taking a look at the soon-to-be-released TT Artisan 56mm F1.8, a lens that I actually really quite like, by the way. We can see that in the center of the frame, the TT Artisan looks great. I would say it looks every bit as good as what this lens does. In the mid-frame, however, you can see that the TT Artisan is not quite as soft, contrast not quite as good. And as we get down to the corners, the difference is a little bit more pronounced. Though if we pop over to this side where the Viltrox is not quite as good, you can see that the margins are closer. Now the major test is the heavyweight in this class, which is the new XF 56mm F1.2 WR lens. And if I stop that lens down to F1.8, in the center of the frame you can see that the Fuji is the easy winner. It's just really high contrast, really sharp. Moving just a little bit off frame, however, or off center, I should say, and you can see that the Viltrox, if anything, is probably a hair sharper there. And you can see that as we pan down throughout this zone as well, that it's just a little bit crisper. And then into the corners, it's not by a big margin, but I would definitely take the Viltrox in the corners. So obviously this is a really impressively sharp lens, and while contrast, doesn't always look like mind-blowing on it, you can see that it looks really good, and that's impressive considering the demands of this sensor. I found even for shooting just in an event type setting, you can see that focus is good, detail is nice and crisp everywhere on the subject, no problem there. And while we'll see in a moment that the lens doesn't sharpen up particularly in the early stages as you stop it down a bit, we can see if we look at this real world comparison where I see a little bit more result than I see on the charts. You can see that I would favor the contrast here, mostly in that the brights look a little bit brighter, allows the shadows to pop a little bit more. And so as we stop down a little bit to f2.2, we can see that it just does produce a little bit better of a real world result. So from f2 to f2.8, there isn't any kind of real or significant improvement that I can see looking at most spots along the frame. There is, however, a bit more of a bump from f2.8 to f4, and then a bit more from f4 to f5.6. And we can see now that we're getting a more even performance everywhere else in the frame. It's looking very sharp, even on the side where this copy was a little bit softer. We can see looking at landscape results at f5.6 that it is super crisp in the center of the frame, but even if we pan towards the left side where the lens was a little bit softer, we can see that it is crisp all across the frame. Great details everywhere. This is a really sharp lens. f8 looks great as well, but by f11 you'll see some softening due to diffraction, and that obviously is going to become more pronounced as you stop down to the minimum aperture of f16. Contrast dips a little bit up close. You can see that there is a pretty good amount of detail here, and the plane of focus is pretty flat, but contrast is a little bit softer and it will sharpen up more as you stop it down. Now, I was also pleased with the bokeh quality. Up close, doing a shot of that new TT Artisan lens, you can see that the blur up close is really nice and soft. In this image here, you can see that while there is a little bit of that swirl effect, there's some kind of lemon or cat eye shape towards the edge of the frame, the bokeh, even in these complex areas, remains nice and soft. And so for portrait type work, I'm surprised at how good this lens actually does. And here's what really surprised me. On the left side, we've got the Viltrox. On the right side, we've got the $1,000 56mm f1.2 WR lens, which is a gorgeous lens, by the way. But you can see that there isn't a huge difference here if we compare them side by side. It is surprisingly close. As far as what surprises me is the colors here are actually really close. If we look down through the dress, the color rendition is very similar. Looking at the background here, I would say that the Fuji background is a little bit softer, but you can tell it's not by a wide margin. Now, where the Fuji advantage comes in is the fact that it opens up to f1.2. And so now if we take a look at this background area, look how much softer the Fuji side is compared to the Viltrox side all throughout that. And then what is pretty amazing is that even at f1.2, the Fuji remains really sharp even on this 40 megapixel body. But as a budget portrait lens, I really loved what I got. You can see that I'm doing the natural framing by shooting through branches. The bokeh is really nice and soft. And if you look here at the detail on the subject's face, it's just beautiful. Skin tones, really, really nice. Actually, in this particular set, I shot with this lens and then also the new Sigma 50mm F1.2. And in this particular kind of pose and setting, I didn't like anything that I got from the Sigma. It just didn't work very well. And while this is not my favorite shot, I actually still like this shot reasonably well, whereas I didn't on the Sigma. And here's a few other portrait shots. You can just see, even at f1.7, the detail is really, really nice here. The background is beautifully blurred. Colors are great. There's just a lot of positive going on here for such an inexpensive lens. Finally, looking at flare resistance one more time, this is the most wide open kind of flare I could induce, kind of a veiling effect. And if anything, it's artistic. I have nothing to complain about there. And so unless you're really, really stopped down, you're not going to see much in terms of any kind of veiling or ghosting. And so frankly, that's another win for this lens. Just a really impressive optical performance.
So congratulations, you have made it all the way through to the very end. Thanks for watching. Have a great day, and let the light in.